I think that if you wanted to point at any singular year in recent history and say, this is it, this is the year that the current Metroidvania craze started, then 2015 would be it. April 22nd saw the release of one of the most underrated, but also one of my absolute favorite Metroidvanias of all time, Environmental Station Alpha. A little over a month prior, on March 11th, was the release of the highly acclaimed Ori and the Blind Forest. And nestled comfortably in between both of these releases, on March 31st, came the unforgettable Axiom Verge. Axiom Verge draws a lot of its inspiration from the original Metroid and manages to capture a very specific feeling of dread, isolation, and wonder as you take on the role of Trace, a scientist pulled from the comfort of his own world and into one far more strange and dangerous. Everything in this game feels extremely wrong and very alien in the best ways possible. You explore this weird world with the help of an ever-expanding arsenal of strange weapons that you collect over time, and the assistance of a horrifying race of sentient war machines who seem to have a vested interest in your success. Axiom Verge is so memorable for a couple of key reasons. First, the abstract and bizarre visual presentation of this world sells the fish-out-of-water element of the protagonist, and the surreal landscapes, creatures, and machines that inhabit it have a way of burning themselves into your mind. And second, the world's design, while not without its hiccups, is extremely well done and rewards thorough exploration with fun new weapons, upgrades, and expansions. What's more unique about this game in particular is its approach to how it powers up the character. The Metroidvania subgenre has become at least a little bit tropey in that you can see some kind of obstacle in your way, like a large cliff, for example, and think to yourself, oh, I guess I'll be getting a double jump soon. But Axiom Verge almost exclusively leans towards more original ways to power up the movement of your character. For example, instead of letting Axiom crawl, you launch a drone to explore those narrow passageways for you. You gain the ability to phase through walls by wearing a special lab coat and running into that wall for a few seconds. And you get a special gun that interacts with so-called glitchy areas of the world and can change the behavior of many of the game's enemies, for better or worse. You'll find almost none of those Metroidvania power-up tropes here. So with all of that, and how generally well executed the game was, Axiom Verge found itself placed high on many people's list of the top Metroidvania games of all time. So naturally, the sequel comes with a lot of hype and a lot of expectations. After an initial planned release date of fall 2020 and some delays, Axiom Verge 2 finally released, somewhat surprisingly, alongside the Nintendo Indie World Showcase on August 11, 2021. I mean, who needs a release date or a marketing push when you have this kind of pedigree? This video is going to have 2 spoiler warnings. The first comes now, because to talk about Axiom Verge 2, I will need to lightly spoil at least a little bit of the game's story and gameplay elements. But the second spoiler warning will come later in the video, where everything is fair game, so here's that first spoiler warning. In general, I think most games, and especially Metroidvania games, are best played as blind as possible, not knowing what kind of power-ups you're going to get, and what the gameplay really entails. So if it's something that you find interesting, then just come back later, please. Axiom Verge 2 begins with you controlling a different protagonist, Indra Chowdhury, a billionaire and CEO of a company called Globe 3, who pragmatically purchased a company after their own CEO went missing. Soon after, Indra received a mysterious message stating that if she ever wanted to see her daughter again, to go to the research station in Antarctica, where the previous company's CEO and team previously had gone missing. After landing at the research base, Indra finds herself accidentally taking a portal to a new world. She eventually comes into contact with a special kind of weapon called an arm that allows her to do incredible things like respawn after dying and summoning a drone, much like the first game. Using these powers and her axe, she's able to fight back the aggressive drones that plague this world. She comes into contact with some of the remaining members of the missing research team, but they are of little help outside of providing Indra with the context of where she is and what's happening. As far as the gameplay goes, Axiom Verge 2 manages to both feel like the first game and not feel like the first game at the same time. Axiom Verge was rather ambitious in its time. It sported many different weapons with many different effects, a weird password system that required experimentation, keen observation, and the patience to read the game's lore dumps, as well as an alternate glitched effect for every single enemy in the game, requiring the player to experiment to determine whether or not glitching each enemy was advantageous or desirable in any way. Axiom Verge 2, while still feeling like Axiom Verge at its core, feels far more traditional in its approach to world and system design. The password system is completely missing, which could be a positive or negative thing depending on how you felt about it in the first game, and the extremely versatile glitch gun was replaced by a similar yet different tool. Instead of a gun, you have the ability to extend a radius and can hack anything hackable in the area, such as some enemies or door controls. Instead of enemies turning into corrupted versions of themselves, you can force certain effects, such as dropping a battery that they possess, making them overheat, or outright turning them to your side, or even slowing them down. This tool is useful in many different situations, but it isn't nearly as interesting as the glitch gun from the first game. Many enemy types have the same few commands available for you to hack, which means that unless you feel a need for one of those few common commands, you're likely to ignore the feature altogether. It isn't just the glitch gun that was changed either. The wide arsenal that Trace had in the first game is not present here. For story reasons, it makes sense, but from a gameplay perspective, many players can feel like this is a major step back from the first game. In fact, Indra does not possess a gun at all. At the beginning of the game, you'll receive a hand axe, and very shortly in, you'll find a boomerang. These will be your main tools throughout the majority of the game, and while you might be inclined to stay at a distance as much as possible with your boomerang, it simply lacks the power that your melee options will provide. So, where Axiom Verge 1 was a game that gave you a large arsenal of weapons to choose from that gave you options on how to approach any given enemy, Axiom Verge 2 really forces you to go in with a limited toolset and asks you to make it work or else. This can make the game feel kinda hard at the start with your limited health pool and many enemies' tendency to try their best to stay out of melee range, making you wish that you had a gun to keep things even. The heavy reliance on melee against the ranged options that the enemies boast makes the game feel like an affair where you're often face-tanking shots until you die. Based on what I've read from other players so far, this is a sort of love it or hate it style of combat. I personally really enjoyed it because once I realized that A, I could use my health as well as my hacking potential as a resource, and B, that I could just run past enemies if I didn't feel the need to engage them, I started having a lot more fun with it. Once I started picking and choosing my fights and adapting my strategy to the resources I had remaining, the game really started to click into place for me. But while the game feels somewhat hard at the start, it can also feel way too easy at the end. If you're the kind of person that thoroughly explores these games, between the health nodes you'll find and the skill points you dump into your skill tree, which is a thing in this game by the way, have fun, you'll have more than enough health and healing batteries to take any amount of punishment that you need to before you find the next save point to heal, which are littered all over the place anyway. Here's the thing though, while the game might feel easy from a combat point of view, I don't view the combat to be at the core of this game's draw. Combat and enemies are nice to have as a mechanic to keep the map exploration feeling somewhat dangerous, because without it, you're literally just walking around and looking around. But it's that walking and looking around for the next place to go that Axiom Verge 2 leans more heavily into. Every Metroidvania game tends to feature some kind of character progression, where the enemies are a threatening roadblock that stops you every few seconds at the start, only to become mere specks of dust as you blow them away with a thought, or otherwise earn the luxury to completely ignore them at the end. This game just so happens to push that trend a little bit more rapidly than others, and that's quite alright to me because the exploration here is so engaging. Axiom Verge 2 does away with the surreal and abstract presentation of its predecessor and again feels far more traditional. You have some clear and familiar looking biomes like water area, snowy mountain area, lush waterfalls area, and arid cliffsides area, just to name a few, and they all look absolutely incredible. This is no Owlboy by any means, but the pixel work here is very good, surpassing the first game by a good margin with its architecture and its backgrounds. If you explore a bit, you'll be given a destination to try to reach on your map, but never told exactly how to get there, so you'll need to figure that out on your own. And it might not be quite as straightforward as you might expect either. You could head in that general direction just to learn that the path is currently impassable with your current abilities, So you look for another way around and stumble upon another arm and are suddenly able to get through, or you just find another way around entirely. And when I say stumble upon, I really mean stumble upon. Many Metroidvanias like to make an event out of your new powers with a special room dedicated to holding it, or even a forced tutorial section afterwards. The place you're heading is often littered with paths that you would need that new ability to cross as well, indicating that you're about to be given a power that can interact with them. But because of the non-tropey nature of Axiom Verge's abilities and the fact that each new arm acquired is just kind of placed haphazardly in the world, not by the developer but by the civilization that put it there, makes each new acquisition feel surprising and rewarding. There's more that I want to talk about, but I'm being intentionally vague here because I believe more specific gameplay elements of Metroidvanias, and especially Axiom Verge with its more original approach to them, should be discovered by each player individually as they play, so they can be surprised. Axiom Verge 2 is full of these delightful little surprises that would be disappointing to have given away by a YouTube video like this. So I have one last statement before we move on to the broader, more spoiler-heavy discussion. Axiom Verge 2 is clearly an Axiom Verge game, but it's not just more of the same like many people probably want or expect. It's not even necessarily an expansion on what Axiom Verge had previously established in its own gameplay, and for that it might be extremely disappointing for many people, and in fact, it is. After I finished the game myself, I went to the subreddit to see what other people had to say about the game and its lore, and found that there is a not insignificant number of people who are disappointed by the more narrow and more traditional design space of Axiom Verge 2. Some people miss the arsenal of the first game, others miss the surreal landscapes, some are disappointed by the low difficulty, and others think the game is outright boring and that exploration is unrewarding. And all of these people are fans of the first game. You cannot go into Axiom Verge 2 expecting an extension of the first game. We've come to expect that from sequels of our favorite games, but that's the wrong approach here. In many ways, Axiom Verge 2 feels less like a sequel and more like another game made by Thomas Happ in the Axiom Verge universe. And what's surprising is, if you begin to understand the lore and how each game fits in with each other, the design space starts to feel extremely deliberate in its approach, its side effects, and the way it feels to play. You must go into this game with a more open mind as a fan of not just Axiom Verge, but of the Metroidvania subgenre in general, and if you do that, then you're going to love the hell out of this game. And with all that said, here's your second and final spoiler warning, because it's time to go in. I mean it. If you ever plan to play this game, click away now and come back afterwards if you're interested in further discussion of the mechanics and lore of Axiom Verge 2. So if you've been paying attention and have played enough of Axiom Verge 2, you'll have noticed that I left out a very important aspect of the world's exploration. Where Axiom Verge 1 took a lot of inspiration from the original Metroid, Axiom Verge 2 feels a lot more like a love letter to The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The drone in this game isn't just there to allow Axiom to crawl or just get launched to hard-to-reach areas. It's the only way to enter a special world called the Breach. Much in the same way that A Link to the Past features a dark version of the game's world that you must travel to and from to reach certain parts of the main world, Axiom Verge 2's Breach must be explored and navigated in order to move forward in this game's world. It's not exactly a one-to-one recreation like the Dark World is, more of a parallel subset that can be laid on top of the main world. And much like the Dark World and like the world of Axiom Verge 1, the world of the Breach feels wrong and oppressive. Navigation through the Breach to reach new arms and new worlds is an extremely important aspect to this game. There's a lot to explore, and if you're going for 100% items and explorations, there's a lot to clear and a lot of small navigational puzzles and challenges to solve to find every piece of upgrade in the game. And since the drone is the only way you can navigate the Breach, learning how to effectively fight with it is also extremely important because you will be spending a lot of time as a drone in this game, both inside and outside of the Breach. This sounds like something that could be considered as a step down from the gameplay of the first game, but remember how I said that the way the game feels and the side effects of the design seem really intentional when you begin to understand the lore? Let's look at that. At the start of this game, Indra is a normal human. After getting sucked into this parallel world, she's lured to her first arm, a Mashalama. Unfortunately, a series of catastrophic events leads to the frozen water Indra finds herself in rising and cutting off her escape just as she finds the urn containing this arm, and she drowns. Luckily, this arm is activated and manages to rebuild Indra, beginning her transformation into something else. Throughout the game, you'll find various upgrades and abilities both for you and your drone, but while Indra herself never sees any significant increase in her movement capabilities from the start of the game, unlike Trace, who is able to zip around pretty freely by the end of the game, her drone receives a few very integral upgrades that help you move quickly around the planet and the breach. During the story, Indra is made aware of a technology that'll allow her body to act independently of the drone, and when she finds it, discovers that it was a trap only after it was sprung. Amashilama was lying to Indra for her own purposes and her own goals, and takes Indra's body as her own, leaving Indra stranded in the then much less capable body of a weak little drone. From there on, you go on a short detour to either somehow reclaim your body or find an arm that can help build you some kind of humanoid form. This section of the game took me about 45 minutes, but between the time spent in the breach and this section that forces you to rely on something that you may have viewed as no more than a simple and weak bit of utility, you come to learn how capable the drone can really be. You begin to appreciate its movement capability, its small form factor, and even its destructive power as it bears down on your foes. Once you find your way back into a humanoid form, the drone is no longer separated from you. It is you. Now you can freely switch back and forth between both forms, and relieved to reclaim some semblance of your humanity, you're likely to ignore it for a while and spend quite a bit of time in your new body. Fun fact, and you might not have even noticed it because the game never outright tells you, but Indra's jump height is actually increased with this new body. Even more fun fact, Indra's jump height is also increased at the beginning of the game after Amashilama rebuilds her, which is such a small and interesting detail that is extremely easy to miss, but is really nice to see. Anyway, over the course of the rest of the game, you'll be exploring a lot, trying to find your way forward and backtracking for item collection, and as you continue to dive in and out of drone form, you'll begin to notice that even though the drone can't climb walls, or jump quite as high, or fight quite as safely as Indra can, it is capable of much higher speeds and much more tight navigation. You begin to realize that you don't even need to fight most of this trash that's in your way, so as you unlock more movement upgrades like hovering and nanite swarm, you'll find that you spend more and more time as a drone than as a humanoid, and more time zipping past enemies instead of engaging with them. During the time that Indra is stuck as a drone, you manage to stumble upon yet another portal to yet another world called the Emergence, which might look extremely familiar. This area has creatures and terrain that is remarkably similar to Sudra from the first game, and is being guarded by a person named Drushka as they wait for the accelerated time behind the nearby gate to advance a few generations. This could be the entrance or gateway to Sudra. The visit is brief, however, and Indra quickly gets back to her quest to retrieve her body and stop Amashilama. It turns out that Amashilama's goal is to retrieve a powerful weapon and use it to travel upstream to Ansur, the root world of Kinger, which is the name of this world, to destroy it and thus free Kinger from its influence. Something along those lines at least. Amashilama eventually succeeds in her goal to retrieve the weapon, and now your job is to find your way to the only known gateway to Ansur and destroy it, to prevent Amashilama from realizing her goal. You succeed, but now Indra is left without purpose. Her old body was destroyed, and now she has no means left to contact her daughter or Dr. Hammond, who summoned her here in the first place. So now what? Possibly as a means to atone for whatever happened to her daughter, Indra decides that she wants to revive Damu, the child-turned-arm from the urn that gave you the ability to use the drone and eventually gave Indra her new body. Unfortunately, the only way she can think of to have the means or power to return Damu to his human form is to explore the advanced technology of Ansur, and she just destroyed the only convenient way to get there. So Indra joins up with Drushka as a means to find her way to Ansur, basically denouncing her own humanity at the same time. I don't really think I can call myself Indra anymore. I am something else. That's where this game ends. Throughout Axiom Verge 2, there is a clear motif of losing one's humanity to become something different and more powerful. Arms are created from humans, and Indra in her final form was created by a set of arms and nanotech. She is no longer human at this point, despite retaining her consciousness. During the end credits scene, some art of Indra's current form is shown, and wouldn't you know it, that's Ophelia from Axiom Verge 1. Ophelia is one of the Rusalki, the giant war machine creatures I talked about earlier. They really like using drones. Also, Indra really likes Shakespeare, as noted by one of the in-game notes, and given that Ophelia drowns herself in Hamlet, it serves as a pretty good new name for Indra in her new form since she, drowned at the start of the game. Ophelia isn't originally part of the Rusalki. She is the outsider spoken of in many notes from the first game. Also, some interesting notes on the etymology of the name Ophelia as taken from Wikipedia. Shakespeare chose that name because in ancient Greek, this word means a great benevolent act or gift, but it sounds really close to this word, which means a great debt or sin to pay for. Indra is torn up about her daughter, possibly in denial about her death, and is riddled with guilt and possibly even mentally unstable, as hinted at by one of the news articles in the game, alluding to mental health medication. This is the same one with the Shakespeare info, and it reads, Dr. Gloria is under fire again for a recent interview with Indra Chaudhary that critics are calling exploitative and sensationalist. After leading with relatively innocuous questions regarding her interest in Shakespeare, Dr. Gloria seemed to goad Chaudhary into making erratic statements about her daughter, Samara. We're estranged, we haven't spoken in years, and that's all I'm going to say. She was shown on camera refusing medication offered by a mental health professional. The language in this note is likely used extremely deliberately by Thomas Happ, and implies more than it seems to just say if taken at face value. If you combine that note with one that is dated just 3 years earlier that talks about Indra taking a leave of absence to deal with a family tragedy, which again is a very specific set of words, seems to paint a gruesome picture of the fate of Indra's daughter, and could explain a lot about this aged billionaire entrepreneur's obsession with finding her, not to mention the willingness to listen to what amounts to a vaguely threatening message with no evidence behind it from the opening cutscene. Come to Antarctica if you wish to see your daughter again. That's it. That's the message. That's a long way to go for a middle-aged CEO off of a single line of text with no evidence, isn't it? Anyway, the whole dead daughter bit is very much conjecture, but there seems to be some evidence supporting the idea that the afterlife in this universe is just another world. Perhaps on Sur that is further upstream from Kinger, especially since you can find a corpse that seems to belong to Hammond really late in the game. Anyway, Indra's great debt or sin is the guilt in relationship about her daughter, while her great benevolent act or gift is her newfound quest to restore Damu's humanity. These facts imply that Indra, now Ophelia, is now hellbent on reaching Sur for her own purposes, and because she's learned that she needs a pattern mind to get there, there are many theories that can be made regarding her connection to the Rusalki and Trace in the events of the first game. And speaking of the first game, it could even be implied that Athetos is simply acting as a guardian to Sur and preventing Ophelia and the Rusalki from reaching it and perhaps causing some great catastrophe. Athetos, known as the original Trace, and Ophelia are simply two sides of a war over the multiverse, and Trace clones are simply caught in the middle as an unwitting pawn. Is Ophelia a threat to the multiverse? Did Athetos really release the pathogen and commit genocide against the Sudrans, or is the pathogen, which seems to be affecting the humans on Kinger now, have a more complicated origin than that? There is so much to think about regarding the game's lore and how Axiom Verge 2 manages to recontextualize the information that was given in the first game. Diving into the lore and the theories makes me appreciate the gameplay decisions made in this game even more, because you can see where every little aspect of the design could fit in deliberately to the larger story that the game is trying to tell, and I am super intrigued. I dropped a lot of lore in what's supposed to be a review of this game, but I think it's necessary to contextualize some of the decisions that were made for its design and judge how they fit and feel in practice. Everything feels deliberate and in service to the greater narrative, which only makes me appreciate many of the quirks and side effects, such as the drone-heavy endgame, way more. Axiom Verge 2 is such a fun and solid sequel, and while many people are extremely disappointed by it because of its missing gameplay features that were present in the first game, and the complete lack of boss fights until the game's final moments, and the less surreal visuals, among many other things, I found none of those to actually be a problem for me. Axiom Verge 2 is not simply more of the same, which is a trap that many sequels fall into and many consumers of sequels might even expect. Axiom Verge 2 is its own beast, and while still a Metroidvania, it's a completely different flavor of the subgenre than its predecessor was, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. The fact that those people don't like this game makes me sad, because I found this to be such a spectacularly designed experience, especially if you have even a passing interest in the lore. Seriously, I haven't had this much fun reading fan theories in a long time, and I much prefer Thomas Happ's approach to mystery and imagination and storytelling over the way Kingdom Hearts does it. Wink! I think that the problem that many of those people could have is that they liked Metroidvanias because Axiom Verge was a good game, rather than liking Axiom Verge because it was a good Metroidvania. Axiom Verge 2 still feels like Axiom Verge in many important ways, and is still a very good Metroidvania on its own. So I'll say again what I said before the second spoiler warning. If you're a fan of Axiom Verge and Metroidvanias in general, and go into this with an open mind to expect not just more of the first game, then you're really going to enjoy this sequel. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much to my patrons for helping keep this channel alive. I'll see you next time.